Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to DSEF's latest installment of our customer-centric webinar series. Really glad to have you with us today. Talk about the horizontal revolution, customers who defy categorization. It's going to be a great conversation. I want to welcome back our good friend and DSEF fellow, Dr. Michael Solomon, who's an expert, author, and trend analyst in the fields of consumer behavior, retail, fashion merchandising, branding, social media. I'm sure I've missed a few of those. Mike is also a professor of marketing at St. Joseph's University and a regular contributor to Forbes. Mike has been kind of a fixture in keynoting and contributing to DSA and DSEF programs over the years. So we really appreciate Mike, you being back with us. I think a lot of you will remember, hope a lot of you remember that at the beginning of the pandemic, Dr. Solomon shared consumer behavior trends and insights throughout our history from previous crises and how we dealt with those and how consumers responded to those in a conversation titled Consumer Behavior in the New Normal. And if those of you that didn't get to see that, we recommend that you visit the DSA website and see the recording. That was a great conversation. Today, Mike is going to talk about another disruption that he's been watching and talk to us about those customers who defy categorization. Increasingly, the traditional market segmentation strategies aren't working well in the environment where each of us is literally a market of one. And Dr. Solomon has described this as the horizontal revolution because the flow of communication across users is as important, or perhaps even more important, than the top-down messages that consumers are receiving from companies they buy from. So fascinating conversation, and Mike will talk more to us about that trend in a moment. First, just a couple things to mention. We want to encourage you to read Dr. Solomon's forthcoming article titled "The New Chameleons, Welcome to the Consumer Revolution." That's going to be in the upcoming issue of DSA's Direct Selling Journal, which had a great launch a couple months ago, and hope all of you are enjoying your first copy of that, but Mike's article and contribution to the second one we're looking forward to as well. Also want to encourage you to pick up Mike's new book. It's titled The New Chameleons, How to Connect with Consumers Who Defy Categorization. Obviously related to the conversation we're going to have today, but fantastic book. And we'll put a link in the chat where you can go to purchase that book as well. We want to make sure that these are valuable conversations for you. So as always, we want to encourage you to be interactive as possible. We want to hear your questions. So as Mike is going through his presentation, please use that Q&A function, chat function, whichever you're comfortable with, to bring us questions and ask Mike what's on your mind and what's going on with your challenges and where you're curious in this area. And to sweeten the pot a little bit on that discussion, if you post a question in the Q&A or in the chat function, you'll be automatically entered into a random drawing to receive a copy of Mike's new book. So great value in getting his thoughts and expertise on the questions, but also potentially that book as well. We'll be in touch with the winner right after the conversation. We'll do the drawing after we sign off. And with all of that, and with our audience instructions, let me hand it over to Mike to take us through the conversation.
All right, thank you, Gary. Thanks for that great introduction, and it's always a pleasure to participate in DSEF, DSA activities. I really enjoyed having the privilege of being a fellow for a number of years now, and well, you even described me as a fixture, so I've turned into a fixture. Okay, let me share my screen here, and sorry, looks like I'm. There we go. You should be you could see my screen, right?
Got it.
Yep. Okay. All right. Yeah. So so I want to talk about some really important changes that I've been observing in the landscape over the last few years, and hopefully it'll motivate you maybe to think a little bit about the way you strategize when it comes to reaching your customers. So let me jump right into that. And this is all about disruption, and obviously this last year has been very disruptive to all of us. But really, what we've been seeing over the last, I would say, 5 or 10 years are a lot of fundamental disruptions that were happening really before the pandemic. And it's important to note that the pandemic on its own hasn't caused fundamental changes in our behavior. Maybe some superficial ones, like obviously lots of mask wearing and maybe elbow bumps instead of handshakes. But the real important changes are things that were already happening beforehand. And what a crisis like this does is it basically throws fuel on the fire of those. It really accelerates the extent to which they are starting to permeate in our society. So again, and Gary mentioned my book, I'll talk a little more about that, but I actually wrote the book before the pandemic hit, just before, in fact, and all of these things that I talk about were going on, but now they're kind of in fast forward, if you will. And we could trace a lot of this, obviously, to the internet. The good old internet gets blamed for a lot of things, but it obviously has changed the way we think about marketing enormously. One of the things that's become so interesting is the evolution of what is sometimes called Web 2.0. Some people even call it Web 3.0 at this point. But essentially, for those of us who remember the old days of Web 1.0, it was very much a top-down, one-way kind of communication, where a company might have a website, and just having the website was cool. You got to put the URL on your company stuff, but really there wasn't a whole lot going on there. But of course, we're now in a period where in Web 2.0, what we have is not a one-way road, but a two-way highway. And there's a tremendous amount of interactivity that's going on. And so when we look at all of the ways that we interact online now, what we see is that the commonality is the sense of community and, again, this sense of horizontal communication, where each of us not only has the ability to talk back to the companies that were talking to us, but also, of course, to talk to the other people who are also talking to those companies. So, a quick visual history of this, and I just grabbed a page from one of my textbooks on marketing. And this one is actually written with Greg Marshall, who's very active with DSEF as well. And what we talk about in the book is that the traditional model of marketing is what you see up here, what we might think of as a one-to-many model, or a broadcasting model. And obviously, over the years now, that has changed. It evolved so that we're sometimes looking at a one-to-one model, where we are reaching out directly as one seller to one customer. And of course, a lot of distributors, a lot of the training that they might get is focused on how they can do that. But really, the more interesting development, I think, is that we're moving to this many-to-many model. And that means that we're able to actually have multiple conversations going on at the same time, literally thousands of them at any point in time, where everyday people are talking about the brands that they buy. And most importantly, they're sharing that information with other consumers. And so everything when we talk about word of mouth, when we talk about influencer marketing, all of these things are related to this evolution toward this many-to-many model, where buzz building is paramount. And of course, we're switching a lot of our communications to social media channels instead of traditional advertising channels. And so as we do that, it reminds us that now more than ever, the holy grail for us in marketing, whether you're in direct selling or in any other channel, is consumer engagement. And the biggest challenge that we face at the same time is consumer engagement, because each of us is so distracted by all of the demands in our lives, and of course all the messages that are screaming for our attention on our phones and other devices, et cetera. And so what I often tell my students is the biggest challenge that marketers face today is just getting the attention of their customers. If you can just get them to look up from their phones, if you will, that is half the battle. And it's one that many companies are, unfortunately, are not going to win. So we have to think about, in this horizontal revolution that we're living in, what can we do to understand how to engage our consumers to a much greater degree? And why should we spend our time doing that? Well, the ROI is clearly there, and Gallup and other companies who are looking at customer experience are consistently reporting that, in fact, there is a premium. You are going to get more ROI, you're going to get more revenue from engaged consumers who are really motivated to listen to what you have to say, and perhaps more importantly, to interact with you. So it's not just a nice thing to have, it really impacts the bottom line. So how can we do that? Well, this really brings us to the issue of what it means to create a brand that is an engaging brand. And we talk a lot these days about the brand story and what is your brand story. The reason that that story is so important is that, to the extent that the brand story syncs with the story that consumers are interested in, that is, as they're exploring their identities, and we're going to talk a little bit about how that's changing, what we see is that the brands that are really successful, again, whether in direct selling or elsewhere, are the brands that resonate with consumers. And what I mean by resonance, this is something that some colleagues and I have written about extensively. We're talking about the goodness of fit between the meanings that you claim, your brand claims, and the meanings that are relevant to a consumer at this particular juncture in their lives. So obviously, as we go through our lives, we have different projects, if you will, we have different priorities, and different things are going to be important to us. And of course, different brands are going to come and go based on their ability to help us to attain these various identities that we're pursuing. So ultimately, what we want is a brand to be totally integrated with the self, kind of like MICHELIN has done here with this little baby. I love this picture. And really kind of visually showing us that we are the brand and the brand is us. So, we have these expressions: you are what you buy, you are what you wear, you are what you drive, et cetera. And there's a lot of research that supports this notion. Actually, that's a topic for another day, but that the things that we consume, in fact, help us to communicate our literal identity, our social identity, not only to others, but to help us to figure out who we are and where we stand in this very complicated society that we live in. So how can direct selling companies get to this point of resonance? Well, there's no one path there. There's actually numerous paths. The important thing is to follow at least one of them. I won't get into all of them today, but I will give you a couple of examples that we've identified. One is what we call personal co-creation. And so we ask this simple question: does your brand encourage your customers to create their own stories about it and to talk about how that brand has impacted their lives? So in other words, they're working with the brand to express things that are important to them. And so we see this in the direct selling space. We should probably see it more. But here, for example, USANA, as you know, very successful company, telling success stories. And so people are getting on there, and they are, in fact, illustrating how USANA, in this case, is practicing personal co-creation as a path to resonance. Another example is intimacy. And here we have brands that have so-called insiders, people who know all, everything there is to know, all the trivia about that brand, how it was created, the people who created the brand, et cetera. Nike is a great example of a brand that has a lot of insiders. Another one happens to be a direct selling brand that you've heard of before. So I think Mary Kay does a very good job of fostering this resonance by encouraging a feeling of intimacy with the creator of the brand. And my experience with Mary Kay is that they do a good job of reminding you about who she was and what she stood for and how she embodies the personality of that brand. Those are two examples in the time that I have. I'm just sharing two with you. If anyone's interested in looking at others, feel free to go to my website. Just go to michaelsolomon.com and you'll find there what I call a brand resonance audit. You can just download that for free, and you can see that there are some other suggested ways that you might create resonance with your customers. So this gets into the question of, how do we, as we're creating this resonance, how can we understand people today and what they're looking for and how they find out about these things? And so I'd like to start with kind of the traditional assumptions that we make about our customers and show you why many of those actually are not very valid today. So let's start by talking about how we train people, marketing students, for example, the students that I teach and other DSEF fellows teach. How do we train them to think about people and to think about customers? And the dominant way that we do this is basically what I like to say is we train them to think that there are two kinds of people. People who think there are two kinds of people and people who don't. And what I mean by this is that we love to put people, our customers, into categories. We like to assign them labels. And just about all of us, anybody who got an MBA in marketing, or if you've ever taken courses in psychology and so on, this study of people is largely influenced by what we call the positivist tradition in science. And basically the scientific method is part of the positivist tradition. And we don't have to get into the weeds about this, what this means, but the point is that we are trained to put people into categories and then to compare and contrast people that we have lumped into these categories. So when you think about a lot of the schemes that you might have internally in your company or others that you come across, it's really common to put people into quadrants. We love to put people, we love to have strategic plans that divide us up into quadrants. And that's just the way that our minds work. It's very efficient for us to do this. But unfortunately, when we do that, we also tend to lose a lot of valuable information by having this knee-jerk response where we start with a fairly large group of potential consumers. And now we say, well, what quadrant are they in? And depending on that quadrant or that category, we're going to treat them one way versus people who are in a different quadrant, they're going to get a different treatment. And so, for example, the basic logic of market segmentation, the way we practice it today, and mea culpa, the way we teach it today, is that we take consumers, we understand that it's almost impossible to create a product or service that will appeal to everybody. And so what we want to do is we want to take that whole pie and we want to divide it into some fairly big slices. And the people who fall into each slice, so to speak, who belong to a market segment, tend to be fairly similar to one another in terms of some basic characteristics, often demographics like gender, age, income, and so on. And so that has been the guiding logic of market segmentation ever since the folks at General Motors actually invented the concept, as far as I know, back in the 1930s and 40s. So this idea has been with us for a long time. And by the way, that was a reaction in part to Henry Ford's assertion that his customers could have their Model T that he sold in any color they wanted, as long as it was black. And so that the Industrial Revolution is based on this idea of mass production, not a lot of personalization, not a lot of individuality. And that has served us pretty well for a large number of years. But once we get into Internet 2.0, maybe not so much. So even when we talk about it, the basic logic of market segmentation, we find that in our society, it actually makes a lot more sense in many cases to talk about literally markets of one, where these traditional approaches don't work as well, because the people that we're placing into these broad segments, just because they share certain demographic characteristics, they really don't have necessarily that much in common with one another, because consumers today are far more proactive about defining their identities than consumers were back in the 40s and 50s and 60s, when these traditional segmentation approaches actually work quite well. So today, we talk about what we call the postmodern consumer. So the positivist tradition is also called the modernist tradition. And today we live largely in a postmodern society. So what do we mean by that? Well, one characteristic is a fragmentation of identity. So again, we're no longer, back in the old days, people were pretty sure about who they were. They may not have liked who they were, but they were sure because they were born in a specific place. They probably died not far from that place. They lived their whole lives there. They had certain organizing institutions that were very constant and steady. And a lot of that has largely eroded in our more complicated society today. So our identities are far more fragmented. And of course, our media and so on that help us to define those identities also are extremely fragmented. There's a blurring of boundaries, and I'm going to focus primarily on this going forward. So I won't talk about this quite yet, but I just want to point out that, again, in a modernist society, it's very easy to put people into clearly defined categories. But today, many of those boundaries or categories are evaporating very quickly. And finally, we're largely defined by consumption. And so again, it's more proactive than it used to be, but make no mistake, brands are still very important to younger people, for example. They just don't relate to those brands in quite the same way as their older brothers and sisters did. So branding is still very important. Consumption, for better or worse, is still a very integral part of our postmodern society. So one way to think about this is I'd invite you to think about going out to dinner, something we all look forward to doing after the pandemic, right? In a traditional perspective, we pick a category, right? So we say, oh, we're going to go out for Chinese food, or we're going to have Italian food, or whatever that category is, that cuisine. And so we have a vertical, if you will, that is pretty traditionally defined. We kind of know what to expect there. There's certain menu items that we expect to see. And everything is nice and compact and labeled. Well, today, really, our lives are a lot more like one of those huge international buffets. Unfortunately, they're probably, a casualty of the pandemic. I don't know if we'll see those big buffets anymore, but bear with me, it's still a good metaphor. When you think about going to one of these, and I'm sure everybody's been to these things, it really is a collection of items from many, many different cultures. So you literally, as you walk down the aisles, you could be putting Mexican food on your plate and Chinese food on your plate and fried chicken and whatever you happen to have on there. That international buffet is actually a lot closer to the way people think today and the way people shop today, because what they're doing is they're moving across these traditional boundaries, and they're very, very eager to sample things from other cultures in the same way as when we go to this buffet, we might want to sample something that we've never tried before. And that's what a postmodern society looks like, where people create what we call a pastiche of images and brands that collectively define who they are as individuals. So that individual identity is much more important for many of us than it used to be. And what that means is I like to think of us today like a chameleon. So here's another metaphor for you. Chameleons, as you know, change their colors frequently, and they do that as they encounter new environments. And so we, I think, are a lot like chameleons in the sense that we're not changing our skin color, but we're changing our identities. We are trying on new things as we make our way through life, and even through the day, we're trying on new identities all the time. And so it's no longer as easy to pigeonhole people as it used to be. So here, for example, we have this guy, and you can tell the story yourself. He's, kind of a button down executive guy, but maybe he's on his lunch hour now and he's sneaking off to get some ink put onto his arm. So he's basically, what he's doing is integrating a very different kind of lifestyle, as epitomized by the guy who's working on him. But he's able to do that today. Now, he may not roll up his sleeve when he goes to work, but you can bet as soon as he gets home that sleeve's going to get rolled up, and maybe he's going to change his clothes and change the kind of music he listens to and lots of things as he takes on a different identity. So shameless book plug, Gary mentioned my book, and it is based on this metaphor of the chameleons. And so the new chameleons are people who are changing their identity so rapidly that traditional categorization approaches really don't apply to them very much. And this is actually a positive thing if we embrace it, because when we think between the lines only, if we only look between the lines and we think in terms of traditional categories, my argument is that we miss out on a lot of opportunities, because people are looking for products that actually cross categories. So it's more of a hybrid experience than it used to be. So I'll give you an example from the fashion industry, where I do some work with the fashion industry. We have a traditional category called athletic wear. It's been around for a long time. People in the industry know it well. Hasn't really done very much in the last 5 or 10 years. We have another category, also kind of stable, kind of boring, called leisure wear. So we have these two existing categories. The companies that are in each of them tend to compete only against those who are also, who have been labeled as being in that category. So what happened, 5 or 10 years ago, or well, really earlier, is that a few people got the idea. They said, well, what can we do to reinvigorate this market? And one thing we can do is to look at an important change in lifestyles as people are experimenting with more spiritual pursuits, like yoga, for example. And why don't we combine the characteristics of these two existing categories to create a brand new category? And so the folks at Lululemon were largely responsible for this, and some other companies as well, that literally created a brand new category in the fashion industry that, as you probably know, is going through the roof, especially with the pandemic. People are looking for a lot more of this stuff. So it's a category that didn't exist maybe 10 years ago, yet it's very important today. So again, we want to take a look at these chameleons, not the old style of consumer, but the new style of consumer who is constantly looking for these new identities. And we want to try to open those cages, let those chameleons out of their cages, let them run free. In other words, abandon some of the traditional assumptions we make about the categories that we often use to describe our customers. So I want to quickly go through 4 examples of cages that I talk about in the book. There are many others I talk about in there, but I won't have time to get through all of them. One of them is is me versus we. And so back in the day when I had dark hair, not gray hair, it was all about do your own thing. And so the individual was really elevated above the group. And yet today, what we see is much more of a kind of a herd instinct, focus on networking, social validation, letting other people know what you're doing. I've had students tell me that they didn't know that their girlfriend or boyfriend broke up with them until they noticed that their relationship status on Facebook had changed. And so everybody knew it at once. And so we in the 60s and 70s, we had what we might think of as the era of me. Today, we have the era of we, where it's become much more important to validate your preferences, your brand choices, by getting the reactions of other people often before you make the choice. And that's a very important distinction. So for example, many of you are aware that user-generated content, again, Web 2.0 at its best, allowing the users of the brand to participate in actually creating the meanings of the brand. That is an extremely powerful strategy today, and there are very good reasons why it works so well. So this promotion that Burberry did a few years ago was hugely successful for them, where they invited actual customers who wore Burberry trench coats to post their interpretations of how they were using that brand in order to share with others. And of course, this is a very common strategy today, and it works very well. Now, here is a diagram that I stole from Google. This is what Google talks about a lot. They talk about the ZMOT, zero moment of truth. And that is the moment where the customer actually makes the transaction. What you see here is that we have a certain irony here, because the internet was supposed to make our lives easier and save us time. In many cases, it's done the opposite. Because what we see is, and my students tell me this all the time, even for very simple purchases, routine purchases, people are doing a lot more research before they make the purchase, before they make the decision about what to purchase. So in the old days, you might walk into a store, whether online or offline, and at that point, that's the shelf that you see on your right here. That is where we are actually making up our minds based on what we see in that store. But today, what we find is that it's far more likely that by the time the customer enters that phase of the sales funnel, they've already made up their mind, and they're just looking for the best place to get that product. Because what they've done is, once they realize that they are in the market for X, whatever it is, they're going to do a tremendous amount of search. They're going to read reviews. They're going to probably look for YouTube videos that have other consumers giving video testimonials about the brands and so on. And they're going to ask their network. So a tremendous amount of work going into what used to be a pretty routine decision, buying a blouse, choosing a restaurant for lunch, what have you. And so we're starting to move toward this, seeing some of these apps and so on that allow people to basically post what they want to do and look to their networks for validation. So with this app, for example, let's say this woman, you have a date on Saturday night, you've picked out an outfit that you want to wear on the date, but before that, you take a picture of yourself wearing the outfit, you post it online, and you let your network vote on whether or not you should be wearing it. So it really is buying by committee, and it's a tremendously important departure from the way we used to think about consumer decision making. Okay, a second cage, moving quickly through these, is offline versus online. So again, back in the day, even when we had the ability to go online, we tend to be conscious of this. In other words, we might say, I'm going online now. Or when you're done browsing, the web, you say, I'm going offline. People today, young people today, don't really do that, because it's not really accurate to ask the question, are you offline versus are you online? The reality is that most consumers today, and certainly my students, I can tell you that, are simultaneously online and offline most of their day, So this dichotomy that we talk about, and when we talk about strategies, how much should we devote to online assets versus offline, et cetera, that point is largely moot today, because what we see is that people are constantly moving back and forth, and they don't really consciously recognize that they're doing that, because while they're talking to you face to face, they're checking their Facebook, they're doing other things. And so really this big debate that retailers in particular have been so concerned about for years, it has largely gone away when we recognize that it no longer makes sense to divide people between the offline and online worlds, especially in an environment, by the way, where the average young person today is spending approximately 11 hours a day of their waking day, 11 hours a day looking at a screen. What we see is that movement toward more and more of our day being taken up in online venues. That's only going to continue to grow, and especially with the pandemic pushing us even further in that direction. So as we spend more of our time online, of course, we're able to do things, we're able to manipulate images, brands are able to manipulate images, but people as well, so that our sense of reality becomes kind of warped. We look at an ad like this for chapstick, and we see these human lips on the pig. I really hope that this is not a real pig. I'm pretty sure that this was photoshopped on afterwards. And so we hopefully understand that what we see online is not necessarily a representation of the physical reality that we're used to. And that's got a lot of interesting ramifications for us, especially, for example, if you're in a beauty related category. We have a lot of manipulation of images. So for example, here we have a model who might appear in an ad, but actually she wouldn't, because even though she's a very attractive woman, she's not perfect enough to appear in an ad. And so by the time she gets photoshopped and now appears online, she literally is not the same person as she is in the offline world. That online depiction of her actually doesn't exist in the physical world, yet we relate to it as if it does. And so there's a tremendous amount of activity going on. Some of you may be aware of this, many people are not, that there are literally millions of people who spend a considerable amount of time in virtual environments, various kinds of online platforms, virtual worlds. Many of them are creating businesses on there. So for example, fashion is alive and well in virtual environments where you can create highly realistic but very inexpensive designs like the one you see here, for example. Augmented reality, everybody's talking about that now. That's another example of the online and offline worlds fusing together, because what's happening is we're taking our physical reality, our physical perception, and we're overlaying that with a second layer of reality, which is our digital reality. So the term augmented means to add to. And so we're taking our physical reality and adding a layer to it. So Pokemon Go was the big craze from a few summers ago, was really the first time a lot of people in the mass market became aware that this technology exists. But it actually has a lot of really amazing applications. Maybe you're aware of these, maybe you're not, but even something as simple, for example, as a smart mirror in dressing rooms that allow you to try on clothing or cosmetics or accessories and so on without really doing it in the real world. Amazing potential there. That's a talk for another day, but I'm very bullish on that. I've been working in this area for a number of years, and it's fascinating how you can combine these two realities to really engage your consumers. The third cage I want to talk about, producers versus consumers. So we no longer have this line that separates the companies and the customers who buy from those companies. So consumers become ad agencies today. So for example, You're probably aware of the long-running Doritos Super Bowl campaign, where everyday people are creating actually very effective commercials, often for less than $100, that are shown on the Super Bowl. Consumers can become product designers. Again, a great way to engage them. So a company like DeWalt, for example, the power tool company, has over 10,000 customers in its Insight community that it relies upon to generate ideas for new DeWalt products. Consumers are becoming service providers, so the so-called gig economy that the direct selling industry talks about quite a bit, whether you're renting out your home or your car or what have you. But most importantly for us, consumers have become retailers. And of course, we call that direct selling to some extent, where everyday people are now becoming distributors. And so the question of how they spend that time and are they able to do it, that obviously is a big issue for the direct selling industry. And I recommend the Ultimate Gig. You may have seen this publication. The DSA has done a lot of great stuff on talking about the gig economy and how that is both a competition for direct selling and also opening opportunities for direct selling. So again, this notion of taking everyday people and erasing this boundary and turning them into professionals is part of what you all do. Of course, it begs the question of whether these people know how to be retailers. And so there's a lot of confusion among direct sellers, people who are new to it. Maybe somebody like this who says, I was never able to make the mental leap from teacher to salesperson. So again, there's a lot of interesting issues, a topic for another day, about the importance of training these people to think not like consumers, but also to think like retailers. Part of the problem is there's just too many choices out there. You all know this. You're competing in markets where there are so many choices, and a lot of our challenges today are simply making sense of all those choices, which is why it's so important to think about these people in the channel, like distributors, as curators of the experience. So that even though the consumer is creating a lot more products or product ideas that are out there, the role of the retailer, the role of the marketer, the merchandiser, is often to act as a curator by proactively reaching into the channel, so to speak, and narrowing down the options rather than just presenting 10,000 options to everybody. So I really think that a very valuable way to think about this in direct selling is to encourage distributors to be curators, to become experts at all of the options that are in their particular vertical, and to establish themselves as experts, often by creating the content that's so important today when we talk about content marketing. That is what will establish them, as give them the credibility that they need to talk to their customers. The fourth one I want to talk about today, we're getting to the end. One kind of obvious one, especially since the pandemic, is work versus play. So we used to draw a line, I'm working now, or don't bother me, I'm playing now. I don't want to hear from the office. Well, we know that today that boundary has been totally obliterated. We're all, we all have Zoom fatigue and so on. Hope you don't right now. But really that boundary has gone away. And so it makes for interesting challenges and opportunities. People buying shirts, but not pants. By the way, relax, I am wearing pants. So, this is really a way that a very important boundary is going away, and we're all going to have to rethink our daily lives when this boundary no longer exists. And so it creates a lot of opportunities as people, and there are reasons that people, for example, hoard supplies like toilet paper at the beginning of an epidemic. Again, that's a topic for another day, but as they're reshaping their homes to be more like offices, and maybe their offices to be more like homes, there is a lot of opportunity, I think, in the direct selling space here. And some companies have done a good job already of taking advantage of this. So we might see, for example, new social rituals like Zoom cocktail hours and so on, where companies might actually be supplying the raw materials that you need in order to host one of these parties. And so if you think just at a very basic level about what you sell, maybe just creating sample kits that can go out to consumers. And so the distributor can host a party, for example, let's say a wine tasting party, if you're in that space, by actually sending samples to people at everybody at their homes, but allowing everybody to share still in the collective experience of consuming those products. And that can be true for home products, for cosmetics, jewelry, and so on. So those are 4 obsolete categories I've gone through very quickly. There are many others that are, I think, very fascinating, such as male versus female, man versus machine. There are many others I talk about in the book, but I want to stop there. I thank you for your attention, and I would love to entertain any questions that you may have about how to engage with your chameleons.
All right. Well, Mike, that was terrific. As always, we appreciate that, and we do have some questions coming in. So let's start with audience questions. I may have a couple if time allows, but let's go straight to it. So first question from Jim. Many companies are leveraging social media influencers and affiliates to effectively buy access to positive social influencing. How do you feel about the effectiveness of that strategy?
Yeah, great question. Well, unfortunately, as in many things marketing, it works at first, and then everybody jumps on the bandwagon and we poison the well for everybody else. I think that it's still an effective strategy, but there's going to be a shakeout. Well, there already has been during the pandemic. A lot of influence of the traditional influencers lost their credibility during the pandemic for being tone deaf, posting pictures of themselves cavorting in the Hamptons and so on, while the rest of us are locked down. So there has been some, there's been some fallout there. But generally speaking, the reason that we look to these influencers is that we view them as objective, credible sources, as opposed to the companies themselves that are, by definition, are biased. So even though the FTC and other regulatory bodies have started to impose some limitations or constraints on what bloggers can do in terms of taking products from companies and not disclosing them and so on, I think we're reaching the point where there'll be a crisis of confidence, because people are no longer going to assume that that person is unbiased. And once that comes out, that the person, is endorsing a product where they receive free samples and so on, the whole thing gets blown up. So I would say that we have a window there where it's still going to be effective, but unless people start to clean up their act, we're already seeing a bit of disillusionment, I think, where, and in fact, what a lot of agencies are moving toward now are ironically finding so-called micro influencers who by definition are not very popular, who have less than, say, 10,000 or 5,000 followers, because they become more genuine. So it's a bit ironic. The successful influencers were the ones who grew their bases to be so huge, and yet in so doing, they've lost some of their credibility.
That's interesting. It's sort of a related follow-up. I think you partially answered this from Sharon, but she's asking about balancing paying social influencers or influencers on social media against looking to those that are already in your realm, loving your products, using your products, and finding ways to amplify their voices.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's one of my pet peeves is that I tell my students, just remember, it's far more expensive to acquire a new customer than it is to keep an old one. And we so often lose sight of that, as everybody understandably wants to expand their market share, their market base. But the reality is, we talk about the so-called 80-20 rule, which is so important to us that, again, as an approximation, 80% of your revenue comes from 20% of your customers. And what that means is that we tend to ignore the ones who are already in our franchise because we're trying to get that next person. the reality is that your most loyal, devoted customers are your single best sales asset. Whether you're in direct selling or in any other kind of channel, people who are really, who don't have to be, so to speak, bought,
right,
by giving them a promotion or, dollars off or something like that. They genuinely, your brand actually resonates with them. Then those are the people that you want to make, encourage. You want to use them as brand ambassadors. You want to especially use them for customer insights, like I was talking about, because what we find is that the best customers in an industry are usually the best sources of ideas for new products in that industry.
Interesting. So from Michelle, any thoughts on the new trend of affiliate programs versus the standard traditional level compensation plan? Is that a new way to drive consumers, independent business owners, or a new norm for the future?
Yeah, I think it is. And anything you can do that ties two entities together in this chaotic conversation that's going on online is certain, and reinforces that connection is certainly going to help, I would think.
Yeah, yeah. And another question from our friend Jim, who is anxious to have a good shot at the book, I think, but good questions as well. How do you suggest balancing the issue of allowing sellers to do the content creation, and the issue of managing product claims and the story about your products, when you think about
Yeah.
supplements, weight loss, those kinds of things?
Yeah, it's a hugely important question. And what we have here, there's a trade-off between engagement and control. In other words, to the extent that we give the inmates the key to the asylum, we're also losing control over the message. But quite frankly, today, and if you look in other verticals like CPG and so on, or companies like Coca-Cola, for example, and initially when customers started to add layers of meaning to the products, like to create their own messaging around it and so on, what these companies did was they had legions of lawyers that would go after them with cease and desist orders. But they figured out after a while that, this is a Pandora's box. The internet, one thing about the internet is once it's up there, it ain't coming back.
Yeah.
And if the more you try to prevent people from talking about your brand, the more they're going to do it.
Gotcha.
So you have to accept the fact that you no longer own your brand. You are a co-owner of your brand. But what that means is there are times, by definition, if a message from me as a user is authentic and credible, it may also be negative. But consumers appreciate that because, and one reason is we've trained them that if they go on a site and it's got all positive reviews, they're probably fake. Yeah. So ironically, what research shows is that when people encounter more of a mixed set of reviews, that becomes more credible, and they actually will benefit from that. So it can really hurt to give up that control, but to some extent you got to be, if you're going to play in this space, in cyberspace, you've got to be prepared. That's one of the things that you have to give up to some extent. So control and engagement are inversely related.
Interesting. Yeah, this is another good one that's come up, and it gets to maybe even your pastiche point about people kind of picking and choosing. But how do we understand our customers on an aggregate level if segmentation is less effective with all these new trends?
Yeah, well, I don't mean to imply that segmentation is useless today.
Yeah,
it's still often a useful first step. But the mistake a lot of companies make is thinking that they've ticked the box because they've put people into these categories. And certainly if you're just segmenting based on demographic variables like income, geographical location, et cetera, you're missing a tremendous amount of richness because today, and again, this really wasn't so much the case back in the 50s and 60s, you have two people, and I think this should be obvious to everybody. You have two people who live in the same city, I don't know, white males, 45 years old, exact same income. One is a plumber, one is a college professor. Are they actually the same? And I think the answer should be obvious. And so you need to, at a minimum, start layering in some psychographic variables to really get at the nuances there. But again, we have for companies that are already actively online, as many of the direct sellers are, you already have a lot of the tools in place to think about markets of one. If you're using if you're using a customer relationship management system, a CRM system of some kind, that's markets of one, because what you're doing is tailoring your messages so that if I know that Gary's my customer and today happens to be his birthday, by definition, I'm sending Gary a message, happy birthday today, that somebody else is not going to get.
Right.
And so it's just a matter of leveraging that and just not making the assumption that just because you put everybody into a big category means they're all going to react the same to your messaging.
Interesting. So this is one I think you've sort of partially touched on in points, but I'm just curious about your broader answer. Is first of all, do you think that in this horizontal universe that direct selling companies have a fairly unique advantage to benefit here? And then, if so, how do you advise the direct selling companies to maximize that advantage in this sort of new world?
Yeah. Well, that's the $1,000,000 question. I think that direct selling does have an advantage because, again, when you think about that horizontal communication, one reason that that's so robust today is that it again boils down to the credibility of the source. Who's advocating buying brand A versus brand B? And what we know is that our peers are more credible than experts are. So, in the educational space, a lot of times my students are more convinced by what other students say than but what I, as the professor, say, right? That's a top-down kind of communication. In the same way, at least in theory, distributors who are not, so to speak, direct selling executives who work at a headquarters should be more credible. And in that sense, they perform a similar function to influencers in the channel, again, as long as they maintain their credibility. So I think that's a big challenge. Obviously, as we know in direct selling, there's a lot of skepticism among some people about the motives of direct sellers and distributors. That is the question that has to be addressed by this industry, which can be done, by better training, more grounding in ethical aspects of what it means to be a direct selling distributor, what your obligations to your customer. And so as long as those things are understood and implemented, then you should have a leg up because you've already got that built-in horizontal base, so to speak.
Right. And kind of to your earlier point, you want to feed and amplify and train and prepare those voices to be the most effective, as opposed to chasing necessarily other avenues on that. So we have another question from Sharon, and she's kind of asking for your reaction to a particular approach, which is amplify the good, address the bad, and delete the ugly is their philosophy on social media. What are your thoughts?
That's a good thing. The problem with that is when consumers figure out what you're doing, they tend to be a lot smarter than we give them credit for, especially those that are motivated to really, if you're one of those brand insiders, like I was talking about before with Mary Kay and Usana and so on, if they know that you're deliberately covering something up, that is far worse than admitting it to begin with. So, you want, one thing you want to do is, the motto, if you will, of the public relations industry is do good and talk about it. So if you're doing good things, don't hide your light under a bushel. But if you're doing bad things or not doing enough good things, I think it can come back to bite you if you try to obscure those. You're better off acknowledging those up front and talking about what you can do to improve. In the same way that companies that have some kind of a scare, like say a product contamination or something like that, we've seen in episode after episode, the companies that come out and admit that rather than trying to rationalize it wind up doing better in the long term.
Gotcha. And I want to say a thank you to Sharon, that in a conversation about new trends that we were able to have a great Clint Eastwood reference emerge from a question or a comment. And also, Mike, I want to thank you so much for all that you've done with us and in partnership with this industry. You've been a great partner as a fellow and a leader among fellows, and we appreciate that very much.
My
And,
pleasure. I appreciate it.
yeah, absolutely. And fantastic conversation today. And I want to encourage everybody again, in addition to the winner of your book, go to that link and get Mike's book. It's fantastic. He's fantastic. And we look forward to seeing you more and working with you more as we go forward. To our audience, I want to thank you all for joining us and just remind you that DSEF is able to partner and benefit and work with great guys like Mike and his fellows because of your contributions. We run completely on voluntary contributions from DSA members. So I want to encourage you to visit dsef.org and donate today if you have not already. And if you have already, go again. We would love that. But thank you all for being with us today. A couple of other things to mention going forward. You can register now for some upcoming virtual and in-person events. How about that? In-person events on the schedule coming up. First on the 19th of May, there's going to be a hybrid how-to, a step-by-step guide to hosting successful hybrid events. Something that's certainly relevant and important to all of us as we go through our work today. In June, where we might normally have the annual in-person meeting, there's going to be a virtual leadership conference. It's going to be a fantastic event, great content, and really want to encourage you to visit the DSA website to get more information and to sign up and register for that event. And then looking very much forward to DSA Engage 2021 Live. The plan is in person in November in New Orleans, November 1st through the 3rd. We look forward to all of you joining us. We look forward to a celebration of getting back together, and we look forward to continuing the great conversations that we've been able to have with Mike and your colleagues and the rest of you. So thank you all again for being with us, and we look forward to connecting again.